Okay, and I'd like to invite up the panel members. So Josh Collins from the San Francisco Estuary Institute. He is the chief scientist. We have Alyssa Dossman from the Restore the Gulf. We also have Peter Goodwin, former Delta lead scientist and the director for Center of Eco-Hydraulics Research at the University of Idaho. We have Stephanie Johnson. She's the senior staff officer for the National Academy of Sciences. National Academy of Sciences, Engineering, and Medicine. We have Scott Phillips, coordinator for the USGS Priority Ecosystem Science Program for Chesapeake Bay. Denise Reed, chief scientist for the Water Institute of the Gulf. And Lisa Wanger, professor of environmental economics at the University of Maryland. So today we have 3 or 4 questions that we came up with as a panel that were, they were compelling to us, and our preparation call was pretty lively, so this should prove to be, I think, an energetic discussion. But what I wanted to do was just start off with some things that I observed from yesterday's conversations and yesterday's presentations on all the watersheds and with funding, things that really stood out to me. And so yesterday I felt like I heard that funding levels vary substantially for each one of these watersheds. I heard that funding for science is really difficult to distinguish from larger funding pots that are for restoration, monitoring, assessment, and science, and that when we can distinguish them, funding for science is a very small fraction. Even just what Alyssa went through in her presentation, I think I did my quick math to figure out that that was about 7% funding for science. And when Ted was up yesterday, he showed the IEP funding budget, and a very small slice of that pie was for science. And I also heard people say that there was a real need for a long-term funding structure for science. And there was a kind of interesting debate about what should be considered part of that science budget, the monitoring, compliance monitoring versus long-term monitoring, assessment, and investigative science. So those were some of the things I heard yesterday, and in thinking about, what Alyssa just provided to us, I wanted to move into our first question, which is, what are some proven and innovative strategies to fund science? And I was kind of hoping that Josh might start us off with some of the proven strategies to fund science.
Wow, well, thank you. It's on. I'm looking at my phone, not because I'm texting or doing email, but I have my notes on my phone. So I didn't realize I was going to go first. It's always an advantage to go last. So I'll be short, because I'm sure there's an awful lot to add on to the few things I'm going to say. When I look at this from a funding side, and I spend time trying to raise money for science, I break it up into, through our institute, which does a variety of science, I break it up into basic science and applied science. And I'm largely focused on applied science. And for where I am in this community, I would define that as science focused on or in the service of place-based ecosystem management. So we're at the ecosystem level, we're servicing a lot of agencies and taking basic science and applying that to answer very carefully devised questions. So it's very applied. Once I get to that recognition that I'm doing mostly applied, and who are my basic partners in academia and in some critically important federal and state agencies that also do basic research, then I look at either capacity building or I look at base funding. Those are 2 very different things. And where I am, capacity building is always entrepreneurial. It's getting the money wherever you can. So it's government and private sector and philanthropic grants and contracts. It's 2 years, 3 years, 5 years off. You hire people, you get seed money, you build things, you get going. Sometimes it takes, sometimes it doesn't. We heard about not repairing or retaining broken wheels. Those happen. But it's very entrepreneurial, using everything within reach to build capacity, which always means hiring people or getting people trained. So it's a lot about human resources. When we get to base funding, and by the way, just to elaborate on that, when I mean entrepreneurial, I mean that's also creating opportunity. That's saying, I think we need the following capacity going forward. We've heard that from others. Where do we need to be in 5 years or 10 years? Where do our partners need to be in 5 years or 10 years? And so he's going, well, I need to go out and rectify and calibrate those ideas, build opportunity, exploit the opportunities that I build, go find money for myself and my partners, and exercise the business of piloting an idea. And if it takes hold, then it moves into program status. But capacity building is rather dynamic. It's ongoing. You build new partnerships, and you chase money when it comes right down to it. Base funding is entirely different. And that's the idea that we've got something that seems to be useful, it's usable, it's getting used, it's being used by multiple agencies. No one of them can fund it. They don't want to fund each other. And so how do we get a collective body of money that will service all the client agencies or clientele or partners through this programmatic application of science? That is almost always, in my experience, hinged to permitting. At some point it comes down to somebody needs a permit, because I'm in the wetlands and rivers and riparian world, and when you do things in that world, the state and federal government gives you a permit, or you don't get it done, or you do it and you go to jail, or you get charged a fine for not getting your permit. So we link program funding, base funding, almost always to permitting, which means that the tools that we use, the science that we use, in terms of programmatic applications, gets built into the guidance of permitting agencies. You will use this approach, you will use these tools, by name gets written in. And then the people who get those permits pay into the maintenance of the tool and the science to cover its charge. That may sound easy, it's very, very difficult to do. But so that's capacity building, which is around entrepreneurship, and then it's base funding, which is around programmatic relationships to regulatory and some management agencies. Okay?
All right, thank you. We'd love to hear from others on like the proven or innovative strategies to fund science. Want to go, Peter?
Yeah, perhaps I'll take a slightly different tack, because I think there's lessons that can be learned from other branches of science. And for those of you who are interested, the National Science Board that oversees the National Science Foundation every other year has a report produced called the National Science and Engineering Indicators. And if you look back over the history of the national investment in science, you see these blips where the funding, which goes up every year, actually took a little bit of a step increase. And so just to pick on two of those examples, there's one in the 1980s. And if you drill down on that data, the reason was that most of that funding went to the NIH, the National Institutes for Health. And they went to Congress and said, we cure cancer. So anyone going to vote against that? No. So a very strong message, and of course many people have loved ones that are touched. It's very personal to members of Congress and the US people. So let's pick another example. In the 1990s, or perhaps I should start out by saying the National Academies has also shown that only about 50% of the American adult population knows how long it takes for the Earth to orbit the sun. Despite that, hundreds of millions of dollars have been spent on the Laser Interferometer Gravitational Wave Observatory, or LIGO. That was set up to test this vague hypothesis about space-time fabric of the universe. And it failed. And it failed probably because we didn't have sensitive enough instruments around the world in this massive scientific endeavor. So the physics community went back and said we need a lot more investment in order to detect this. And of course, that was hugely successful. Gravitational waves were discovered. For those of you who have children or grandchildren, they know what a gravitational wave is. It really captured the national attention, and perhaps more importantly, it developed a lot of our national pride. This was something that was US inspired and solved. And so if you look at these big increases which we see in science, there's a series of common elements that I think has relevance to what we're doing. First of all, it starts with a big vision. You're putting a man on the moon. Think of all the scientific achievements that were spin-offs of that vision. We cure science, or we cure cancer. We haven't solved it yet, but think of all of the outcomes of that research. Secondly, for this to be successful, the scientific community comes together and speaks with one voice. So the physics community got together. The biggest challenge which we face in physics is related to this fundamental piece in our theory for how the universe was formed. Thirdly, and we heard this in some of the sessions this morning, there's a champion and there's two. One, you need the champion on the political side. Who's going to carry this through? Rockefeller's been a great advocate of science over many decades. And you need the Dave Wagners to tell you who to talk to. To really be that bridge between the science community and getting the message across. But there's also the champion in the agencies. We see Randy Fiorini sitting in the front, Felicia Marcus you've heard from. These are folks faced with incredibly difficult decisions where their entire professional reputation may result on one decision they make. So how can we structure science to provide the support and the cover for these big decisions? Fourthly, we discussed this last night, lessons from Texas. What's good for Texas is good for me. So if you're a politician from Texas, you look at how they've improved their universities over the last 3 or 4 decades. And it's been this consistent pressure to fund scientific research to where they now have universities that compete with the California system. Another one is a demonstration. If you're going to make this kind of investment, what are the little exemplars, the examples that proves that what you're trying to do is going to have massive success? And then I would say, finally, we need the communicators. Several people have said that. And again, to go to another branch of science, do you remember the NASA explorations? And you think of the Mars rover, and they started out talking with a guy showing up front at breakfast TV in a pinstripe suit, and just basically reading a script. And then with the Mars rover, that changed, and they actually went into the control room, and they had the young guy or the young woman, tie-dyed t-shirts, sandals, hadn't slept for 3 days, and they were excited about what was happening. And the way they communicated that, it got into the schools. Schools started watching. So not only having those exemplars to get it across, but also to communicate. So I think those are some of the elements we should be thinking about.
Wonderful, thank you. One of the examples you just used from science reminds me that in our preparation talk, we spoke with Lisa quite a bit about different types of investments and where you can get your funding. And since you do have a private element to a lot of space science, I was wondering, Lisa, if you might want to chime in about private, public, cooperative funding programs.
Yes, thanks, Aaron. And I just want to say, there's not much of a segue between what he said and what I'm going to say. But we're going to dig down a little bit here. Oh, and I also wanted to point out to Denise that there are more women than Scots on this panel.
I'll have to check the next panel, but I think we win on gender diversity panel.
Okay, but moving on. Okay, so in all my answers, I'll be giving the economist perspective. And so Joel touched on this yesterday, and that is that economists think about 3 ways to motivate behavior: legal, economic, and social institutional. And so it's the same. I'm going to almost give the same answer for everything, because these are the ways that we influence things, including where we get our funding from. So Josh already pointed out one legal mechanism, building things into the permits. Similarly, basically you use the legal structures to motivate people to want better science. So and there's a basic strategy here of you give them something painful to do unless they can demonstrate they can achieve the same performance in some other way. So you motivate them to build the science that will let them find a more innovative solution. And the example in the Bay has to do with, we've realized that we have this large dam on the Susquehanna River that has suddenly stopped holding sediment, and now this is changing the dynamics. And the company that operates the dam, Exelon Power, their permit for the dam is coming up for renewal. So this is going to be an opportunity to potentially ask them to do something expensive. And so Exelon immediately jumped on this idea that they would like to fund some science to talk about what are the most cost-effective ways to lower sediment delivery from the dam. So that's an example of using a legal mechanism, although I think that also is an economic mechanism. It's in their best financial interest as a company to invest in the science that will help them find a good solution. So, and I think that's a general concept, that you want to try to make it in the company's best interest to perform, and you see this a lot, say with resource damage assessments as well. There's similar things that go on where you ask for a certain amount of mitigation and the company's motivated to invest in science. So it doesn't always end up meaning more investment in science in a way people would always want, but I think that's part of it. And there's lots of that on the implementation side. So I feel a little constrained in my answer in that we're talking predominantly about funding science, but if we think about science as also being getting out on the ground, putting projects on the ground, seeing what works, I think there's a lot to be said for building it into the business model that they want their implementation to perform, and that's all part of paying for performance. One thing that we've done in the Bay program to motivate that is imposing an impervious surface tax on businesses and residences too. But you can get out of that tax by demonstrating that you've reduced your stormwater outflow, for example. So I'm digressing a little bit, but I think the same principle would apply with science. And then on the social and institutional side, you know, we economists don't really believe that people do that much that's not in their bottom line interest. But there really is something to be said for you can pressure people. There's peer pressure. There's millennials are known to want to work for very environmentally forward-thinking companies. So there are certain reasons that companies are interested in looking like good environmental actors, and then there's also the threat of regulation, which motivates a lot of behavior as well. In the Bay Area, it's probably more the latter right now. I'm working on with a group called the Delmarva Land and Litter Challenge, and I think it's a really nice consortium of folks where there are confined animal feeding operations that are not regulated. You remember our issues have to do with nutrients, and animals are a big source of those nutrients. Rather than working down the regulation from the large CAFOs to the medium-sized CAFOs. The medium-sized CAFOs are very motivated to have a discussion about a good way to handle the litter from the chicken houses. And we're working with government people, we're working with legislators, and we're coming together around this idea of let's find a good cost-effective solution, and there is some money going into science as a result of that from all those sectors. So those are some examples.
Okay, thank you. What about some other members of the panel? Denise, I remember yesterday you mentioning that you felt that there was very little funding for academic science, and just to talk a little bit about the differences between funding for long-term monitoring versus academic investigative science projects and science needed for long-term restoration projects, and how the funding structures for those overlap or don't.
Yeah, I do think we've been challenged in identifying longer-term sources of money to fund kind of investigative, innovative, idea-driven science, and perhaps the challenge there is how that produces something which is usable in the end. I'm not sure that I've got any ideas on innovative approaches there, except I do think there are some things that scientists can do who are motivated. I think the key thing that I've noticed is that you need to be ready when something happens. Because if I think through Hurricane Katrina, and I think through the Deepwater Horizon oil spill, and I think through Hurricane Sandy, and I think about the kinds of work that even just I am personally interested in coastal dynamics, there have been enormous opportunities as a result of any of those to actually do some good work, because people are in great need of answers in that time of crisis. And so that requires being nimble, being responsive, and being kind of prepared to go a little bit outside of the traditional kind of funding mechanisms. And that's not always a comfort zone for university scientists. For instance, those of us perhaps this isn't quite such an issue in the Delta, but I know it is in the Bay. The massive interest these days in what is currently called coastal green infrastructure. The idea about whether or not, they call them horizontal levees in San Francisco Bay, whether or not coastal restoration can actually mitigate sea level rise, which I don't believe, but storm surge and waves. And that is a huge area of needed research. And the reason people are desperate for that, for some information there, is because it's potentially so much cheaper than building grey infrastructure and rebuilding grey infrastructure over and over again, but there are real issues and questions about the effectiveness and reliability in a life safety kind of mode for natural features. And so Sandy funded a lot of that. I think after Katrina, there was some emphasis on that. So no matter, if you're interested in those kinds of things, I think it behooves the research community to be ready to respond and to go after others. I did just want to mention one, perhaps not that innovative, but interesting approach that has been taken relative to one of the pots of money that Alyssa again described. One of the pots of money on the diagram was in the National Fish and Wildlife Foundation Gulf Environment Benefit Fund, right? We live these acronyms, and I always get NIFWIF wrong. If I can say NIFWIF, I just can't actually say the words in the right order for what it stands for. But so they have $1.2 billion, and it has to be spent on either river diversions or barrier island restoration in coastal Louisiana. And as the state of Louisiana draws down those funds, they just spent, I think, $135 million on a barrier island restoration project on the coast. They have managed to get NIFWIF to agree to a percentage of the construction dollars being set aside for what they're calling adaptive management. I think NIFWIF is not actually quite sure what that means at the moment, and we all know that they're probably not quite sure what it means. But I do think that there are opportunities there, right, when there are these large kind of influxes of funds for these governmental structures and procedures that Alyssa just described, to actually not just look at the science boxes on that diagram, but to think about how we can actually get some specific money set aside from the other pots to fund science, and Alyssa described that, or also, as I described yesterday, to use those processes of getting projects on the ground as opportunities to do studies which are really then usable in that context.
Mm-hmm. Josh, you had something you wanted to follow up with?
Yeah, I think I want to amplify what I think is a cautionary note. On the topic of innovation, one way is to repackage some of the ideas, and the notion of green infrastructure and what was referred to as a horizontal levee is a good example of that. It's not a new idea, but it's repackaged in a way that is more marketable to more people, more attractive and more understandable, in part playing on people's concerns and fears, and maybe overpromising. So the flip side to that kind of innovative approach is that sometimes it short-circuits the science process, and in fact there isn't the kind of regional, scientific, multidisciplinary examination of the ideas before they go forward. And so they have to be retrofitted. The danger there is that expectations will be dashed, and there'll be a recalibration of the idea, and maybe the best part of the idea gets thrown out with the other part we don't know. So it's really important not to short-circuit the science around innovation. The other thing that I would say is we've heard something about, probably enough about data management that I dare bring information technology under the umbrella of science. And there I think there is real opportunity for innovation in terms of funding. One of the things we're facing here in California and elsewhere where I'm working, and there are people in the audience who can speak to this better than I can, is a very difficult situation of a state or a federal agency having adequate control over data that may be evidentiary with the QA/QC processes involved, but not being able to cover the cost for all of that. Or if we get serious about science enterprise in the name of ecosystem management and adaptive management, multiple agencies needing to share an information system and the cost of its maintenance and having no fiduciary mechanism to do that. So where do these tools sit? This is a big problem. It was mentioned today that we have AB 1755 in this state that's requiring for transparency of data accessibility for groundwater in the Central Valley, that will belong to one agency. I can almost guarantee you that the fact that it belongs to one agency means other agencies won't exactly trust it. So we have this issue of using technology in a cross-program, cross-agency way where the tools for that use, including database development and management, probably can't belong to any one agency, but they can't always spend money on each other. So how do we create that system in terms of data management? The other aspect of that is that as near as we can tell, no state yet invented, nation state or state of the nation here, can keep up with technology change. So somehow we have to link ourselves to those places of technology invention and keep reasonably apace with it. However, you can get so far ahead of the agencies that they can't use the tools that come out of Silicon Valley and elsewhere. So around information technology, there is at once a huge opportunity to be innovative about marketing and about paying for tools, how to keep them useful, and what is the fiduciary mechanism for both accounting for the cost, who's paying for what, and making sure there's QA/QC of the data being used are really outstanding issues at this time. The innovative possibilities are there, but accountability is yet to be proven.
I think that's an excellent segue into our next question, and maybe even as sort of partially providing an answer to it, in that we need to think ahead and be forward-looking and consider how we evolve our science programs to support our resource system goals, and what are the methods of doing that. And I think Josh just really highlighted one of the big challenges that we have for advancing technologies that are way ahead of our abilities sometimes to transition a monitoring system that's been with us for 20 years, and to pick a technology and move forward with it, or to have that information infrastructure so that we have a place to put our data so that it's available to people already QA/QC'd. So this next question for the panel to consider is, how do we evolve our science programs to support resource system goals? And what are methods for making science programs efficient and strategic? And this is where I was hoping Stephanie might have some ideas to share with us about making programs efficient and strategic.
Great. So I'm with the National Academy of Sciences, Engineering, and Medicine, and we're, if you aren't familiar with it, we're an organization that is a non-government independent entity, but it was chartered by the government to provide scientific advice to the nation. And this is advice on science as well as at the interface of science and policy. So much of what you are working on relates to things that we do, though we're also involved in medicine, public policy, many social science, a range of issues. But I've been involved in Everglades restoration for the past 12 years. The Academies has been involved in it since 1999. And it has, as you've heard from other speakers, the opportunity to provide that kind of outside independent review can be extremely valuable to a program from a funding perspective, because it shows to your funders that this independent entity believes either you're on the right track or you're willing to consider criticism along the way to look for improvements. And one example was an early review we did back in 2002 of a Park Service science program. So it was a pretty small program. It had once, I believe, $8 to $12 million a year for funding, but it was being cut, and Congress was looking to eliminate it entirely. So they brought the academies in for an independent review, and the review was actually quite critical of how the program was managed. It didn't have good peer review. It didn't broadly reach out to scientists to get the best scientists to be engaged. But what it did say is it's worth improving that program, because it's worth having the Park Service, who was the steward of the land, be the ones to have their own science program. And so it gave them the motivation to work to improve the program and continue that science program on. So that's one example of how independent review can be helpful. It brings with it some criticisms that are hard to deal with at times, but it helps them move forward. And in the case of the Everglades, we have been in a biennial review process since 2004. And we can look to many instances along the way where having an external committee that can keep the eye on the long-term goal, but provide kind of outside insights into what are the science and sometimes non-science issues that simply need to be resolved to move forward, present some independent ideas. In some cases, we identified situations where scientific uncertainty was being used as a barrier to prevent restoration from moving forward. Scientific uncertainty wasn't the problem. It was the conflicts among stakeholders that were the problem. But the committee could say, there are ways through science to move this forward. If you can take some action on restoration, work incrementally, use science to show how you can make progress on these issues and help resolve the problem. So that's one example of how independent review can be helpful. The other issue I wanted to raise was the issue of building capacity in science communication. And communication has come up several times during the meeting. It's an issue I think collectively this group needs to work on, it needs to think about how to advance it. There are issues that I've witnessed from a staff side, just asking questions about a monitoring program in the Everglades was slashed by 50%, and the scientists were terribly upset, and the managers were quite happy with their decision. And there was this conflict that there was a lack of communication, but so this independent panel tried to get in the midst of it, and they couldn't even understand what the costs versus the benefits of that cut were, because I think the scientists felt like monitoring is inherently valuable, and they hadn't learned to articulate the value of what was being cut and what was being lost. And so down to, it's important that science communication skills be built at all levels. We at the academies think science communication is incredibly important. We have awards that the National Academy of Sciences gives out for good scientific communication, but we bring in people. We brought in Alan Alda last year and his Institute for Science Communication and his staff to train our people to be better storytellers. I think all of us could improve our skills because it's hard work. We're used to communicating with other scientists. I see that as an opportunity for future type conferences in science governance or NCER to have special workshops focused on science communication to build those skills.
Thank you. We have another, go ahead.
So, I mean, we've heard about trying to, I guess, evolve science to take advantage of crisis situations. I guess there's also the strategic approach of if you can know a particular change is coming, to be ready for it. So one change, political change, with new administrations coming in, I think you all have an opportunity to really try to have your message honed in what you're trying to accomplish. I think a lot of the science, we need to be able to articulate what the issue is, how we can help solve that issue, and then show how we've done some joint planning, that we've used all we have to our best available ability, and this is why we need more. And if you can lay that out pretty compellingly, you can make a case to try to get some more funding or try to make some change. And I guess, when we think of change, another thing is, one example we have in the Chesapeake is, we had a lot of monitoring in the tidal part of the system, looking at the water quality conditions, dissolved oxygen clarity, like we talked about yesterday, but we didn't have much up in the watershed. And we wanted more monitoring up there because that's where the practices are being put in to reduce nutrients and sediment, and we wanted to be able to detect that signal. So, of course, the groups that were heading up those two monitoring efforts didn't want to give any ground, so we got an independent review through the STAC that Lisa heads up, and they were able to go through and really look at trade-offs between moving some money around, and then we're able to get a group to develop options that were then approved so we could evolve the science to have more of a balance between the monitoring we did both up in the watershed and down in the estuary. And we were able to then move about, I guess, almost 25% of our resources from the estuary up to the watershed to have that more balanced approach, and then use that seized money to build the network I was talking about yesterday. So I think having that independent review to push the change along just accents and enforces some of what the other folks have said already.
Yeah, go ahead, Lisa.
Yeah, thanks, Scott, for bringing that up. And I think the key issue, again, the economist perspective on how to make your program more efficient, is that you're really targeting it to the decisions and the decision makers. So the impetus for this was that people wanted to know what was working, and the signal was getting lost in the noise of the estuary. And this way, we could at least know if the loads were being reduced. So it was much more responsive to the decision makers' questions. So similarly, I think there's some broader issues that come up. Hang on. I wanted to bring up this issue of the green versus gray infrastructure. So I had this in my notes as well. So people come to me a lot and say, we want to value all the ecosystem services of the green infrastructure. And I say, well, whose decisions are you trying to influence? And they usually say private property owners. And I say, I think you might be more successful if you showed that it worked as well as the gray infrastructure, that you're not asking people to take a bigger risk with the green. And that's really what prevents them. Of course, they can see it's prettier and they'd rather have the birds than the concrete, but it's the risk that's driving that decision. Now, alternatively, if you're trying to influence the people who might be providing cost share money, then they do want to know the social benefits. They want to know, what is society getting back for this investment in public dollars? And then that is an appropriate sense of what science you need. But I think that's really the essence of what it comes down to, is your program will be efficient and be seen as being responsive to decision makers if you're building science that really affects specific decisions, specific decision makers. Now, that's not to say that you shouldn't try to build in some stuff people haven't asked for yet. So, and I think this is where STAC is a model for. We were originally set up as an independent review board. We're 36 independent scientists, although we have representatives from the federal agencies, we have representatives from the state, more political end of things. But at our heart, we're just a bunch of scientists with different types of expertise. And so what motivates us, what we find more professionally satisfying, is thinking about the bigger picture issues, not just reviewing, did you, use the right form of this equation in your model? So even though we were originally tasked with just doing reviews, we basically made a case that we needed to be proactive in thinking about things that were going to affect the Bay program farther down the line. And so we built the capacity for more interesting scientific questions. We kept the scientists better engaged, and we've been able to deliver some things that they didn't know they needed yet. And eventually they were like, oh, that stuff you've been pushing, climate change for the past 10 years, we're ready to listen now. So that you have to be a bit strategic.
Yes, of course.
Can I ask a question? I think one of the things that Alyssa had in her slide was this idea of don't use broken wheels, right? And so I'm intrigued by this idea of change, right? When something's been going on for a long time, I was talking to somebody at lunch about this. How do you switch it, especially when there are individual scientists who've been receiving money for a long time? And Stephanie talked about kind of the academy as kind of an external review body coming in, and the STAC has an interesting role, I think, for me, because they're kind of internal scientists, right? And I think the idea of how these review processes can instigate change and how that is perceived by those that are being changed, because science is actually some people. And I think that I think that's necessary, but I think it's difficult. And I think there's something that we could perhaps think about outside versus inside. Do the people coming from outside, when you're in an academy panel, do you really know as much about the people who work on that system? Whereas the STAC really know that system really well, but it's probably your colleagues that are doing the work. I just think I'd be interested in some conversation about that.
Well, and probably should let Scott talk about this too, but I would just one quick response is that this idea of reallocating the monitoring budget was quite contentious. And yes, we were friends with the people we were hurting, and that was also painful, but we set it up as a scientific process. What goals are you trying to get to? What monitoring will get you to those goals? And we tried to abstract it, to more, let's all agree on the goals, and then we'll agree on what the monitoring should be. So that's one approach. But yes, I hear what you're saying too about the internal folks. So in that sense, it was bad to be internal in some ways, right? But exactly. So, but we also knew what the decision makers had been asking us, for years. And so, yeah, I think there's a trade-off there. Others want to comment?
So I would say also that this issue of, you have knowledgeable semi-insiders as your reviewers helps when you really need detailed input, because Academy's panels tend to be at the 20,000-foot level. They can be asked very narrow questions, and we can populate it accordingly, but these are not committees that tend to revise your project plans. They are looking broadly at goals and support systems to attain those goals. And so it's complementary in a way where you can provide one set of science input at a level of detail and another at a broad strategic level, but more independent.
Go ahead, Josh. Oh, I'm sorry, Peter.
Actually, I was just going to make a quick remark about one of the things I think that works so well here in the Delta is that, yes, the NRC will come out and do these big reviews periodically. It's external, it's heavy-hitting, well-written. And then the role of the ISB, who are much more integrated on a frequent basis. They're around for 5 to 10 years sitting on that panel, but still outside. Seems to work very well here as a model.
Josh?
Yes, one of the things to keep reminding ourselves, at least I keep reminding myself, about adaptive management is that the goals themselves have to be revisited. So the way we look at it, of course, is you have science to help establish the goals, you have science to track progress or explain other outcomes of the management actions and trends towards the goals, and science to explain trends relative to the goals. You have science to report on the goals. And then you have science to revisit the goals. And so a big part of that, which I think Dave Wegner mentioned already, was that any program, once you manage to institutionalize a body of science, then you have to have people outside the institution or outside the enterprise come in agnostically and review it. That puts a huge burden on the manager of the program to make some hard choices about human resources and their own direction and funding. But you have to have that external review process, which has to be, I'll use the term agnostic, that is, it doesn't really care about the outcomes, so long as it's straight up and legitimate and objective. And that can be very difficult. We have a couple of programs that subject itself to that kind of review, and then have to address the advice that comes through it.
It is interesting thinking about just the internal example that Scott initially described and Lisa followed up with. I think there are plenty of people in this room involved in the interagency ecological program who know how difficult it is to be asked to reallocate monitoring resources, and especially in a case where much of that monitoring is compliance monitoring, and some of it isn't necessarily available for reallocation. And it sounds like you did a fairly large expansion of a monitoring program without additional resources by taking them in the zero-sum game from someplace else. And that sounds like a very challenging thing to have to achieve.
Fortunately, when people heard the value of both the estuarine and the watershed monitoring, we basically bought more money from other places. It started as just, we're going to have to shift $1 million from the estuary to the watershed, and it turned into finding money from other places in EPA, so we didn't have to cut the estuary nearly as drastically.
Oh, well, that's a nice positive outcome in the in the growing budgets, flat budgets scenario. And it gives me a wonderful segue into our last question, which we are hoping to end on an up note. And that is that it seems like you effectively made the case for science by growing your budget there. But I think that one of the main things we talked about in our preparation for this panel was how important it is to make the case for science and how important it was to include an economist on this panel, because a lot of times we're asked as scientists to be able to describe almost the commodity value of advancing knowledge, which is really challenging. So, you do science to advance knowledge. We want to do our monitoring programs so we get an idea of assessment and trends and status. When we have a status or trends we don't like, we need to really do science to figure out why something's going in a direction that we don't want. So that's where we find ourselves making the case for science and really supporting what we say is our need for long-term monitoring or our need to do additional science. And so I was hoping we could hear from each one of the panel members on, what is the case for science funding? Anybody want to start?
Yeah, the case for science funding, I think in my experience has really been helping people out of a bind, right? That they're in a bind and they need some information and they need some help. Sometimes they need somebody else to blame, but I think that can be really useful. I do think that there are some approaches. I don't know if we had a little bit of discussion during this meeting about uncertainty. I don't know if you're familiar with a new professional society around decision making under uncertainty, which is getting organised. Actually, having a meeting at the World Bank in Washington in a couple of weeks. But there are approaches when you really kind of dive into exploring the uncertainty around a decision space. There are approaches that can be used to actually identify the value of information. And so the idea of really quantifying how much narrowing the uncertainty can save resources or kind of refine the decision in a very economic way. And so it's not work I do. It's work that I'm very interested in hearing about, but I do think that when you get into the details of some of these decisions, and you're really struggling to think about the need for science, then actually, and sometimes uncertainty seems to be a distraction from that, but I actually think that you can turn that around. And that if you can describe the uncertainty around the decision, then you can actually make a case for the value of narrowing that uncertainty through science.
We're just going down the line here.
Sounds good.
So one of the take-home messages from yesterday that I thought was a wonderful point was to turn that question on its head. Can you afford not to be doing the science? And what's the consequences if you don't have the science? I mean, certainly here in this system, probably a lot more dispute in the courts, a lot more time spent on trying to resolve issues. So I think that was a very valuable point. Secondly, I think the ability to leverage funding. So one agency steps up with partial funding. Of course, IEP is a little bit different because that's a wonderful, well-established model. But one agency steps up, starts doing science around a certain issue that affects a lot of other folks. Other people start contributing to that source of funding. And suddenly you find a lot of different groups taking ownership and interest in those outcomes. So building the science community through leveraging different funding sources, I think is also very possible. The one thing I just wanted to pick up on, one of the comments too, about taking opportunities of the crisis du jour. And I think it's very dangerous to rely entirely on that type of funding. Because one, when that happens, you don't have the resources in place. It pulls already totally stretched agency people off onto that particular issue. And you tend to lose sight of the long-term system goals that were described in topic 2 or question 2 there. Because the system goals are in the long term, and we're working in these very dynamic systems. And if you're responding to the last hurricane or things like that, and that's where your focus finishes, then you can lose sight of a much bigger picture. So yes, it's great when we get the latest bond funded or the latest crisis funding, but I think somehow there needs to be the encouragement for multiple sources of funding just to maintain the basic science enterprise which we all rely on.
Can I just say something? I need to clarify that because
Really quick, we got to
because,
get through
I
everybody.
seem to be saying these things in these few days that are kind of, I'm obviously not saying them right. And I was not trying to say that everybody who's working on one thing should suddenly divert themselves to work on the crisis. In fact, I was suggesting this morning, I think that what was suggested in the Everglades was inappropriate. In that, I was thinking about individual scientists and folks sitting in universities who are really looking for opportunities for new money, as opposed to steering the enterprise in one direction or another. But at the same time, when you work in a system like ours, and perhaps the one here, understanding those extremes and those mega stresses is actually pretty important. And it's quite difficult to do unless you can actually be there in the moment. And so this issue about coastal green infrastructure that we grapple with, being there when the water is really deep and the waves are really moving across the marsh we're going to have to be there at some point. Otherwise, we are not really going to be able to understand and provide usable information to somebody who wants to move that forward. So I just wanted to clarify that I wasn't kind of steering the whole enterprise ship in a different direction. I was suggesting that maybe we kind of cast a boat over the side and go and investigate while the ship stays on its course.
No, and actually, of course, that's a good point, but you're dealing with limited resources in terms of staff time, and we just need both.
Yeah, it's a matter of being nimble with the staff, right? I mean, the idea is also there are additional resources available sometimes during those points, and so it's not like there's a limited pot of money and we have to steer it in that direction. What I'm trying to say is sometimes these emergencies provide funding opportunities, and additional resources are made available by different entities. And so I think being able to take advantage of opportunities and not being too stiff and rigid in your investigative structure is important. We have to be nimble to understand the dynamics of our system.
Sure.
All right.
And the drought, as someone has said, is the biggest experiment you could have designed. So that's.
And I'll just be very brief. I think that
We might have time for one question from the audience. That's it.
Yeah, I'm going to be brief. So I think the value of information can be sold as a way to save the money. Don't spend money on stuff that's not working. Find the stuff that is working. And I also think you have to remind them of when you saved the money. And so that's where communication comes back in. And I just wanted to see if folks knew that we have our own newspaper, essentially, in the Chesapeake Bay called the Bay Journal. An NGO funds this with some help from EPA, as I understand. And they're very professional scientists who tell our stories extremely well and boil down all those long reports into very interesting articles. And I think I know the young people are laughing at me with the printed paper, but a lot of decision makers are old people, and they read.
Go ahead. No, go ahead.
I just wanted to quickly make the point about the importance of science and monitoring for accountability. And when you are using the public's dollars, they often, I don't know why, it seems to be forgotten that the public might want to know how well you spent them. And there are some systems that do that extremely well. I'll say Chesapeake Bay has a wonderful system where they have it. You can go to a website and Chesapeake Stat and find out how all the different indicators are doing. Other systems really struggle with communicating how well they're doing, and other systems struggle to even find the money to monitor to even be able to find out how well they're doing.
All right. So I have found in the case for science funding that the NGO community, especially the advocacy groups, have been hugely helpful. I mean, so I mentioned we had over 65 thousand comments on our comprehensive plan. We had 60,000 comments that were like science review panel, science review panel, science review panel, 60,000 comments. Our decision makers listen to that, right? I mean, these are elected officials. I think some of the things that Dave talked about, really working with the communication, the IUS Association, and I know it's observing systems, but humor me, we've gone back and forth with monitoring. But, you know, a couple years ago, they went on this advocacy for like, we want HFR radars and these 5 IUS, not all 12 across the country for these specific reasons. And they did the Hill, they worked the Hill, and they actually got an increase in appropriations in a time where nobody's getting an for observing systems. And they communicated well, and they were targeted, and they had a message, and they had a very specific ask, and they could tell every single person, even people like in Kansas were voting for this, right? About like why it helps you when you go on vacation. If you get, I mean, but they really were very specific and targeted, and but that data and information is also very helpful for scientists and modelers. So really understanding who your decision makers are, who holds the purse strings, and what is it that makes them tick? I mean, I work with a lot of politicians that are on election cycles, and if, you know, Denise mentioned helping people out in a bind, helping people make better decisions. If you invest in the science, we're going to help your restoration project be more successful, and you're going to look better. And you might get reelected because you're going to look better. I'm being serious. Like, I know that sounds, but it really is. That it has a lot to do with it. And so really thinking those things through, not just I'm sitting in a room working on my science all by myself, but really thinking it all the way through to the usefulness of my science, right? To the usable, is my science really usable, and what is in it for the people who actually have the funding to make the decisions? And so I think that is a big case for science if you think it through and are really strategic.
Yeah, I'm following along those lines. I think it comes down to just be able to have the science tell decision makers they can do their job more effectively, and in 2 ways. Usually in a big ecosystem, you're trying to say, where can I get the biggest benefit by putting in practices, whether it's water quality, ecological benefit. And you can say, I can use the science to help you focus the area where we get the most benefit, and then I can use the science to monitor to say whether you got the desired benefit. And if you can show those 2 things, they just make sense to people.
Maybe I get to be the last word here. I have very little to add except I'll say this, that the organization where I work is 25 years old. It started with 5 people and $15,000. Now it's 62 people and about $9 million a year. That's not a very big organization. So consider the scale of what I'm talking about. In that context, this is how we sell science. 3 ways. We can use science to move you off top dead center. That's an immediate application of science. You're stuck on an issue. It's a technical scientific issue. We can bring the people together, and we can move you from where you are to the next issue you land on, and maybe we can help you again. Second of all, it's the accountability piece. You are taking tax dollars to deliver something you've promised to the public, and you need some science to show that you're doing that or you're not, or explain why. That's a big thing. We just passed a piece of legislation in the Bay Area requiring everybody who owns land, it's not even a regressive tax, doesn't matter how much land you own, you pay the same amount of money into a restoration authority to restore wetlands around the bay on the promise that it's going to help protect the people from climate change and sea level rise, it's going to restore species, all kinds of things. And we worked hard to get written into that piece of legislation the idea that there'll be some accountability of that, and that will be science doing that. Finally, and this is the biggest thing, and this I take away from my last conversation with people at the School of Public Policy at Cal. They told me that there are 2 major endeavors of our species that account for change so well that we can reverse it. One is the law, where every decision is accounted for in writing and it is archived and kept and you can refer to it. It's called case study. The other is science, where through publication we keep track of what we think is right and wrong, or likely or unlikely. because of that accountability of ourselves to those processes, we can reverse our decisions and explain why we're reversing our decisions. So that's a piece of accountability, but you need science to explain why you're going to change your mind and account for that, and then get the money to keep going on the different direction.
All right, thank you all for chiming in. I'm wondering if we have any audience questions. We have about 4 minutes, so, okay? Nice block.
I just wanted to say I always go for the lady. No, this is Anitra Pali. I work with the Department of Water Resources. I work on large-scale restoration. And a very real issue, that problem we have, and I'm wondering if other people are dealing with this in their systems, is that we get a lot of support for our projects through bonds. Our bonds cannot be put into endowment funds. This is a very real problem. We do not have very good ways of funding long-term management and the scientific monitoring that goes along with that when you're doing a restoration project. So ridiculously, we can do the restoration project, but we don't know how we don't have the money for monitoring and for assessing it and for long-term management. So if anyone else has this issue that they're dealing with, I'd love to hear from you. Thanks.
You know, I appreciate the question because an endowment is a tool you can use for a long-term funding structure, which we didn't get into today on the panel, but is something I think that science programs are interested in developing, how we do a long-term funding structure for science and or restoration in terms of what is the long vision for this property after the restoration actions have ended. So does anybody on the panel want to take that?
I think that's the endowment idea is good. There's a couple of maybe solutions, innovative solutions about funding we didn't talk about. That is one of them. The other is in this state, and different states have different ways of doing this, what's allowable. We have joint powers authorities that can be created among agencies, and money can be parked there to become a fiduciary agent. And then what they can do is they can charge the agencies a subscription fee or a user fee or a membership fee for the program that they belong to. We can also establish what are called public service corporations within agencies, which enable them to move money in different ways than they can through their normal budgets. There's also the endowment idea, but a big part of this kind of funding innovation is who's going to be the fiduciary agent? What are the legal ways of moving money across programs? There are ways of doing that, and we don't explore them enough. In this state, we have a couple of really innovative things that go on where the private sector is actually doing all the work and it's being paid for. I mean, they're getting money from different agencies to cover what part of the service, they need to pay for. So I'm covering things very quickly here, but endowment is one of those ways that we can recruit money. But the big thing on the other side is who gets it and how they redistribute it.
Do we have other questions? I think we have time for just one more before we move to the break. Everyone wants to go to the break. All right, well, let's give our panel a round of applause. Thank you, everyone.